It all began on an ordinary morning that should have been like any other. She woke up, made her coffee, and scrolled through her phone. Then her world cracked open with a single message. A simple, heartless text: "It's over. I want a divorce. Don't contact me." At first, she thought it was some kind of sick joke. Who ends years of marriage with a text? Her hands trembled as she stared at the words over and over, her chest tightening as though someone had stolen the very air she was breathing. No explanation, no conversation, just a digital goodbye that cut deeper than 1,000 arguments ever could. Shocked, she tried to call him, but the phone rang only once before going straight to voicemail. She sent messages, desperate, asking why, pleading for answers. Silence. That silence felt louder than anything she had ever known. Panic set in, and she logged into their bank account, hoping to distract herself, to feel grounded. But what she saw there pushed her to the edge of despair. Zero balance. The account they built together, the one that carried their savings, their emergency fund, and every bit of security they had, it was gone. Every last cent had been transferred out. He hadn't just left her, he had stripped her of stability, of safety, of everything they had worked for. She sat frozen, her mind racing, her heart shattering. Betrayal didn't feel strong enough to describe what she was experiencing. It wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was an ambush. One day she thought they were building a life together, the next he had vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but a cruel text message and an empty bank account. Friends later told her she should be angry, but in those first moments, it was only pain that consumed her. Pain so sharp it felt physical, like she had been stabbed in the back and left to bleed out in silence. The hours dragged on like days. She sat in her kitchen staring blankly at the wall, replaying every moment of their marriage, trying to find the cracks she must have missed. Was it her fault? Was there something she hadn't done, something she should have noticed? But deep down, she knew this wasn't about her shortcomings. This was about his choices. He had planned this. No one drains a joint account overnight without forethought. He had been preparing to abandon her long before sending that cold little text. And that realization made her pain twist into something darker. When the shock began to dull, her mind searched for answers. She reached out to mutual friends, hoping someone knew where he was. At first, no one wanted to get involved. Then the truth began to trickle in, little pieces of gossip that hit her like stones. He hadn't just left, he had run away to be with someone else. A younger woman, someone he had been secretly seeing for months, maybe longer. The money wasn't just taken, it had been used to fund their secret life. Dinners, gifts, vacations, all at her expense, all behind her back. The betrayal deepened until it felt bottomless. Not only had he discarded her like she meant nothing, he had stolen their future together and handed it to someone else. Every time she imagined him smiling with that other woman, buying her things with money that was supposed to be theirs, rage flared in her chest. The sadness was still there, but now it burned with anger too. He had underestimated her. He thought a simple text and an empty account would leave her broken, helpless, powerless. But as the days passed and the full picture of his lies came into focus, something inside her shifted. She wasn't going to crumble. She wasn't going to let him disappear into the sunset with her money and her dignity. He believed she would do nothing, that she would be too devastated to fight back. He had no idea that, in betraying her so completely, he had ignited something far stronger than pain. And though he didn't know it yet, his greatest mistake wasn't leaving her, it was believing she wouldn't rise from the ruins he left behind. Days turned into weeks, and the raw wound of betrayal slowly began to scar over. At first, she could barely function, moving through her house like a ghost, every corner whispering reminders of the life they had once shared. But grief has a strange rhythm, it doesn't stay the same forever. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it shifted, and what had once been overwhelming sorrow hardened into determination. She realized that collapsing under the weight of his betrayal was exactly what he expected her to do. He wanted her paralyzed, unable to respond, while he built his new life without consequence. And that thought alone gave her the strength to start piecing herself back together. She began small, making lists, organizing bills, reaching out to friends she had neglected while drowning in the pain of her failing marriage. The first time she smiled again was when one of her closest friends reminded her, "He may have left you, but he hasn't taken you away. You're still here. And you're stronger than he realizes." That simple statement lit something inside her. She wasn't just going to survive this, she was going to take back control of her life. She contacted a lawyer, carefully laying out the details of what had happened. With every document she handed over, with every bank statement that showed his secret withdrawals, she felt power slowly trickling back into her veins. Her lawyer listened quietly, then leaned forward and said, "He thinks he got away clean. But he made mistakes. And those mistakes are going to cost him." It was the first time in weeks that she felt hope bloom inside her chest. At night, when the house grew quiet and loneliness threatened to drown her again, she reminded herself that this was temporary. She wrote down her goals on paper: justice, stability, and dignity. Every step she took now wasn't just about surviving her husband's betrayal, it was about building a new foundation on her own terms. She didn't tell him what she was doing. She didn't send him angry texts or confront him about the other woman. She stayed silent. That silence wasn't weakness anymore, it was strategy. Let him believe she was broken. Let him think she was powerless. The less he suspected, the harder the fall would be when the truth came crashing down on him. And so she worked quietly, steadily, building her case, gathering every scrap of evidence. It wasn't easy. There were nights she cried herself to sleep, mornings when she woke up feeling hollow, but the fire inside her never went out. The plan was simple now: she would meet him in the one place he couldn't twist his lies or hide behind excuses. She would face him in court, and there, in front of a judge, she would show him what true strength looked like. When the day finally came, he walked into the courtroom smug, dressed in an expensive suit she was certain had been paid for with the money he stole. He carried himself like a man convinced he had already won, like someone who believed the outcome was predetermined. He glanced at her briefly, expecting to see defeat in her eyes. But instead, he saw calm, steady resolve. She sat tall, her lawyer at her side, a quiet storm waiting to break. The proceedings began, and at first, he carried himself with arrogance, answering questions with ease, smiling when he thought he had the upper hand. But then her lawyer began presenting the evidence, transaction after transaction, proof of hidden expenses, records of lavish gifts and secret vacations that lined up with the dates of his supposed business trips. Each piece of paper was like a hammer pounding cracks into the facade he had built. His smirk began to falter. His confident posture slumped. The silence in the courtroom grew heavier with every revelation. Then came the final blow: messages between him and the other woman, discussing how he had drained the joint account to fund their new start. The judge's face hardened, and murmurs filled the room. His betrayal wasn't just a moral failure now, it was legal theft. What began as his power play had turned into a devastating trap of his own making. By the time the judge delivered the ruling, he was no longer the smug man who thought he had won. He was a man stripped bare, exposed, and humiliated. He was ordered to repay the money, compensate her for damages, and surrender assets he had tried to hide. She, on the other hand, walked out of that courtroom lighter, freer, and stronger than she had ever been. For her, it wasn't just about winning money back. It was about reclaiming her voice, her strength, her dignity. He had tried to erase her with a single text message, but instead, he had written the first line of her comeback story. And as she stepped into the sunlight outside the courthouse, she knew this was more than an ending, it was the beginning of a life he could no longer touch. The day of reckoning arrived with a heaviness that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. She had prepared for this moment for months, gathering every document, every transaction, every shred of proof of what he had done. Still, walking into that courtroom was like stepping into the lion's den. Her heart pounded, her palms damp, but her resolve never wavered. This was the moment she would no longer be the victim of his betrayal. She would be the one in control. He entered the courtroom moments later, his arrogance filling the room before he even opened his mouth. He wore a tailored suit, his hair slicked back, his smirk polished and practiced. He carried himself like a man convinced of his victory, like someone who thought the judge would take one look at him and side with his charm. He glanced in her direction, expecting to see a broken woman, fragile and defeated. Instead, he saw a calm, steady face that gave nothing away. That alone unsettled him, though he wouldn't admit it. The proceedings began, and at first, he answered questions with an easy confidence, painting himself as the wrong party. He tried to spin a story of incompatibility, of a marriage that had simply run its course. He claimed he had taken the money out of necessity, for bills, for obligations she supposedly neglected. But then her lawyer stood, and the atmosphere shifted. With the steady rhythm of a practiced strategist, her lawyer began to lay out the evidence piece by piece. Bank statements with unusual withdrawals. Charges at restaurants hundreds of miles away from home. Plane tickets for two, purchased with their joint account, to destinations she had never even heard him mention. His smirk began to falter when the lawyer presented receipts for expensive gifts, all purchased during the same period he claimed to be struggling financially. Then came the damning proof. Messages between him and the other woman, openly discussing how he had drained the joint account to fund their new life together. The courtroom went still, the weight of his betrayal hanging heavy in the silence. The judge's expression hardened, and for the first time, he looked unsure. By the time the questioning ended, the confident man who had strutted into the room was reduced to a shell. His shoulders slumped, his voice grew defensive, and the charm he once relied on fell flat. The mask had been ripped away, exposing the selfish, deceitful man underneath. She didn't need to gloat, didn't need to say a word. The evidence spoke louder than anything she could have said. When the judge delivered the ruling, it was swift and merciless. He was ordered to repay the stolen funds, compensate her for damages, and surrender assets he had attempted to conceal. His betrayal was not only recognized, it was punished. And as she sat there listening to the judgment, she felt something she hadn't in months: peace. Walking out of the courthouse, she no longer carried the weight of his betrayal on her shoulders. She was lighter, stronger, and freer. This was more than just legal victory, it was the reclaiming of her dignity, her strength, her future. He had believed he could erase her with a text and a theft, but in doing so, he had underestimated her resilience. In the days that followed, word spread among friends, family, and even his colleagues. His reputation, once polished, was tarnished beyond repair. The man who thought he could walk away unscathed was now the subject of whispers and judgment. Meanwhile, she built her life anew, piece by piece, on her own terms. Every decision she made, every step she took, was no longer overshadowed by him. Her revenge wasn't just in the courtroom ruling or the money she regained. It was in her strength, her survival, and the undeniable truth that she had risen above everything he tried to destroy. He had thought she would crumble. Instead, she had transformed. And that transformation was the one thing he could never take from her. She looked back only once, not with longing or sadness, but with clarity. His betrayal had once nearly broken her, but now it stood as proof of her resilience. The ending he had written for her had turned into the beginning of her own story, one where she no longer lived in his shadow. As she stood on the threshold of her new life, she smiled, knowing that justice had been served, dignity restored, and freedom reclaimed. And for him, the man who thought he could vanish with everything, the true punishment was realizing she no longer cared.